says, "Hear the word of the Lord, ye children of Israel. For the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break out, and blood toucheth blood. Therefore shall the land mourn, and every one that dwelleth therein shall languish, with the beasts of the field and with the fowls of heaven, yea, the fishes of the sea also are taken away. Yet let no man strive nor reprove another, for thy people are as they that strive with the priests. Therefore shalt thou fall in the day, and the prophet also shall fall with night, and I will destroy thy mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget thy children, as they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore will I change their glory into shame. They eat up the sin of my people, and they set their heart on their iniquity. And there shall be like people, like priests, and I will punish them for their ways and reward them for their doings. For they shall eat and not enough; they shall commit whoredom and shall not increase, because left off and take heed to take heed to the Lord. Whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart. My people count out their stocks, and their staff declareth unto them. For the spirit of whoredoms hath caused them to err, and they have gone a whoring from under them. They sacrifice upon the tops of the mountains, and burn incense on hills, under oaks and poplars and elms, because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor your spouses when they commit adultery, for themselves are separated with whores, and they sacrifice with harlots. Therefore the people that do it doth not understand shall fall. Though thou, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend, and come not ye unto Gilgal, neither go ye up to Bethaven, nor swear the Lord. For Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. The Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place. Ephraim is joined, idols, let him alone. Their drink is sour, they have committed whoredom continually. Her rulers with shame do love giving. In verse 19 as well, the wind hath bound her up in her wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we do thank you, Lord, for this wonderful day. We thank you for the privilege of being together in your house. And Lord, we pray as we come now and we look once again at the book of Hosea that you would undertake now. I pray that you empower me through your spirit. That, Lord, you give me wisdom and guidance from on high as I speak. May it be your words and your thoughts, Lord. And may you take your word and apply it to our hearts this morning, where we receive a blessing from your word as we understand the truths contained therein. I pray these things in Jesus' name. With chapter 4, we find that Hosea now begins to deliver a series of sermons unto the nation of Israel. Of course, we're talking about the northern kingdom here, the northern kingdom of Israel. And these sermons that he delivers over the next few chapters reveal unto us three prominent characteristics of our God. In chapter 4 through to 7, we see the holiness of God. In chapter 8 through to 10, we see God's justice. And then in chapters 11 through to 14, we see his love. And so he focuses on God's holiness, God's justice, God's love. You know, each of these characteristics can be, of course, in the first three chapters, in the sermon of action sermon, of Gomer and Hosea. Okay, we saw the picture there of Hosea and Gomer, how it's a picture of Israel and their sin. And indeed, in the action sermon contained in that first three chapters, you can see all three of these characteristics of our God. But what Hosea does now is he sort of expands upon everything he said in the first three chapters. He expands upon it now. In a much deeper way, he reveals these truths to us. And God's holiness is seen as God demands Israel be indicted for their sins or charged for their sins. God's justice is seen as God's justice demands that they be punished for their sin. Between the two of them, between God's holiness and God's justice, you have God's love at work. And of course, God's love seeks for the nation of Israel to be restored. And we've talked about that already previously. That's God's ultimate goal for his people. You see, this was God's ultimate desire for his people to be restored back to him, to once again have a relationship with him. God wanted to forgive their sins. God wanted to have sweet fellowship with them. You see, the northern kingdom of Israel was not ready to have fellowship with God. And the reason was that they had not repented of their sin. Neither had they even recognized their sin. They were denying their sin. They were living in it. They were flaunting their sin. And so we find here in chapter 4 that God conducts, if you like, a trial. He calls Israel to the bar of justice. And he calls them to answer the charges that are laid against them. In verse 1, we see it begins by saying, "Hear the word of the Lord, ye children of Israel, for the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land." The word controversy here is the idea of a legal charge against someone. That's what the word means. It's the idea of a legal charge brought against someone. And so in essence, what I have here is the Lord is saying, I have charges against the nation of Israel, against the inhabitants of the land. The Lord brings an indictment, if you like, against Israel, a list of charges for which they must answer. And this morning I want to see those who are called to stand before the Lord and the charges that are laid against them, and then I want us to look at the warning given to the southern kingdom of Judah. So look with me first, if you would. The nation as a whole is called to stand. The nation as a whole. In verse 1 we read, "Hear the word of the Lord, ye children of Israel. The Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and adultery they break out, and blood toucheth blood. Therefore shall the land mourn, and every one that dwelleth therein shall languish, with the beasts of the field, and with the heaven, yea, the fishes of the sea also shall be taken away." Now, we first of all read here as we begin chapter 4, we see that the whole nation is called to stand before the Lord. The nation as a whole is charged. The nation as a whole is called to answer these charges that are laid against them. In verse 1, it says, the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. It's the inhabitants of the land, the whole nation as a whole, that he first of all addresses here and calls to answer for their sin. The charge that's laid against the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, the charge in essence can be broken down to the fact that they have broken the commandments of the Lord. When it all boils down to it, this is what God charges them with here. You have broken my commandments. You see, they're in the covenant that the Lord had made with them back at Mount Sinai all those years earlier. Go back to Exodus 19, if you would. Just briefly, Exodus chapter 19. Verse 7. We'll start back in verse 3. He went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say unto the house of Jacob, and tell of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all answered together and said, All that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. In verse 8 it says that the people answered and said, All that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. They had agreed to obey. The Lord agreed to the covenant of the Lord. All those years earlier, as Moses came and unto the people the words of God, they agreed to the covenant. They said, all that God commands, all that God says, we will do, we will obey. They made a promise with the Lord. Israel had not kept that promise. Israel had not kept that covenant. Israel had broken the covenant that they had made with the Lord on that day. They had broken their covenant with him. Now, as we've seen many times in the first 3 chapters, they were like Gomer. They were an unfaithful wife unto the Lord. And that was the whole picture of the first 3 chapters, their unfaithfulness to God. The fact that they turned their back on the covenant with the Lord and instead they had forsaken him and sought after false gods. So has broken the covenant with the Lord. And as you read on in verse chapter 4, it says at the end there, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. Essentially here we see clearly expressed for us what the problem is, the evidence of their breaking of this command. You see, Israel had forsaken the truth. It says, because there is no truth. They had forsaken the truth. They turned their back on the covenant, the commandments of God. Because they turned their back on the truth, the result was no mercy. There was no mercy in the nation, no love towards one another. You see, when people reject the truth, when people reject God's covenants, God's commandments, the result is always that they end up exploiting one another. The result is no mercy. And the reason for this is clear, because the commandments deal with our relationship with God and they deal with our relationship with one another as well. So we turn our back on the truth, commandments of God, the result is no mercy. The result is exploit one another. There's no love towards each other. Now, I thought it was quite interesting that these two come up here, truth and love, mentioned together in the Old Testament. Because last Sunday evening in 2 John, that was the focus of that passage, the relationship of truth and love. Sunday before, Pastor preached on truth and love. I didn't pick this passage, it's there. It's not you putting it there, the Lord's got it there. It's come up awful lot, this idea of the relationship between truth and love. Israel, because they had forsaken the truth, there was no love, there was no mercy, because the two go together. The relationship between the two is once again clearly here in the Old Testament. The relationship between truth and love, truth and mercy. You see, their lack of obedience to the truth, their lack of love for God, led to a lack of love to one another, a lack of mercy towards each other. They have forsaken the truth. There was no compassion. There was no compassion for the poor. There was no compassion for the needy. There was no love for their neighbor. The people were hard-hearted towards each other, hard-hearted towards the needs of each other. They didn't care about anyone but themselves. It stemmed from a lack of obedience to the truth, obedience to God's commands in the first place. But at the heart of the problem was their lack of knowledge of God. Verse 1 ends, it says, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in them. Essentially, you could boil it all down to this. This is the heart of the problem. Basically, the forsaking of the truth and the forsaking of mercy stemmed from the fact that the people did not know God. The people did not know God. They did not have a knowledge of God. This means much more than just knowledge about God. This word knowledge here is describing a deep personal relationship with God, a knowledge of Him, a deep knowledge of God and what He is like. The Hebrew word that's used here is used to express the relationship between a husband and wife, that intimate relationship, that intimate knowledge. That's the word that's used here. And so the point is that Israel did not know God. They had no relationship with the Lord. They didn't know Him at all. Not because God hadn't revealed Himself unto them. God had revealed Himself unto the nation of Israel, back at Mount Sinai in particular, with the commandments. God had revealed Himself, had revealed what He was like unto the nation of Israel. They had turned their backs on God and they had forgotten the Lord, had not retained God in their knowledge. And this lack of knowledge of God caused them to turn their back on the truth, which in turn led to a lack of mercy and love towards one another. Verse 2 goes on and describes clearly for us the result of this lack of knowledge. It says, by swearing and lying and stealing and committing adultery, they break hearts, and blood toucheth blood. Here Israel is charged by God with breaking His commandments. That was the result of this lack of knowledge. They broke the commandments the Lord. They treat each other with mercy and love. They didn't know the truth because they didn't know God. He points out clearly here to the people, he says, you want to know how you've broken my commandment? Here it is. By swearing, by lying, by murder, by stealing, by adultery. All of these things are clear violations of the Ten Commandments. Back in Exodus chapter 20. I don't have time to go there, but they're all clear violations of how they have broken the Ten Commandments of God. You see, clearly evident here is Israel's departure from a knowledge of God. And it was manifested in the forsook the truth and they forsook mercy towards one another. Demonstrated by these very things, lying, stealing, murder. These things are no mercy. They stem from a lack of the truth, which came from not knowing God. We know the charges here are not finished. Now, verse 2 does not end by saying committed adultery. It then goes on to say they break out and blood toucheth blood. Now, these words express to us the complete and absolute moral decay of the nation of Israel. You see, the words they break out here express a complete lack of restraints. The idea is that they've broken free of the restraints of God's commandments, of the restraint of God's covenant, God's law, God's truth. They've broken free of all moral restraint and they've forsaken all knowledge of God. And they're living an absolutely disgusting moral life. That's what the Lord is painting here. That's the picture he's painting. He's saying Israel is living a life of debauchery. They've forsaken the Lord. It says they have cast off all restraint. They break out and blood toucheth blood. In other words, blood runs in the streets. Acts of violence run into one another. It's a daily occurrence. People are murdered on a daily basis. There is violence in the land. There is moral corruption in the land. And it's all the result of Israel retaining God in their knowledge. And the consequences of their sin were soon to follow. So that's what verse is about. Verse 3 says, therefore shall the land mourn, and every one that dwelleth therein shall languish. With the beasts of the field and with the fowls of heaven, yea, the fishes of the sea also shall be taken away. See, verse 3 is going to tell us that their sin was going to bring suffering. Their sin was going to bring suffering to the nation of Israel as a whole, but not just to themselves, but also to the land. It was going to affect the land. It was going to affect the animals in the land. See, God had promised when Israel entered into the promised land, he'd promised them that if they remained true, if they remained faithful to him, kept his commandments, God would bless them. But if they forsook him, if they defiled the land with their sin, judgment would soon follow. Judgment would come. See, the land that they lived in belonged to God. It was lent to them by the Lord. But you know, Israel had polluted the land of their sin and judgment was coming. Judgment was soon to follow. Turn back to Leviticus 18 quickly, if you would. We see this described, that this was the promise of God, that this would happen if they turned their backs on him. Leviticus 18. Verse 25 says, and the land is defiled, therefore I iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. Ye shall therefore keep statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. The land spew not you out also when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. For whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them shall be cut off from among the people. Therefore shall you keep my ordinance, that you commit not any one of these abominable customs, which were committed before you, and that you defile not yourselves therein. I am the Lord your God. God had said the nations before Israel, the Canaanite nations, had defiled the land. That's why they were judged. That's why Israel came in and wiped them off the face of the planet. That's why Israel wiped them out of the land. Because they had committed abominations. They had defiled the land and warned them. He said, don't follow in their footsteps, or the land will spew you out as well. And Israel is in that predicament today. In this passage here, as Hosea speaks, is committing the very abominations of the Canaanite nations before them. They're in sin and wickedness and judgment with them. You know, as you read the charge here against the nation of Israel, you know, we can see a picture or a description of the world as a whole today, can we not? We can see a description of our nation in this passage. You see, the world has clearly forsaken all knowledge of God. And that is ultimate reason that they do not obey the truth and they do not act in love, because they have forsaken all knowledge of God. Turn to Romans chapter 1. Romans 1 outlines this clearly for us. Romans chapter 1. Look from verse 17. It says, "For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. For God hath showed it unto them. For the things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was dark. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into the image made like unto corruptible man, and to birds, and to four beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave up unto vile affections. For even their women did use the natural use of that which is against nature, into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet. And even as they not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them." Now, Romans 1 describes the nation of Israel at this time, and it describes our nation that we live in today. Our nation has not retained God, and the world as a whole has not retained God in their knowledge. Instead, they've turned to worshiping the creature rather than the Creator. Now, I mean, that's clearly evident today, isn't it? Is it not, with all this talk about climate change and the greens and everything else? They're worshiping nature. They're worshiping creation rather than the Creator. God has, as it says in verse 26 there in Romans, given them over to their vile affections. They break out, as it says here in Hosea, there is no restraint in the world today. Just like the nation of Israel, the world is a place of moral decay. It is a place of violence, blood. Every night there's murder in the news. Every night there's violence in the news. Every night there's moral corruption there before us in the news. The nation of Israel in this passage is a description of the world as a whole, the world that you and I live in. It stems from a lack of knowledge of God. That's where it comes from. Because they did not retain God in their knowledge, they've forsaken the truth, and there is no mercy. The sad truth is that this world, just like Israel, is facing judgment. There is coming a day where mankind will answer for their sin. The tribulation is coming, the 7 years of tribulation spoken about in Revelation. And God will pour out his wrath upon this earth. Mankind in that day will reap the reward of what they'd sown, what they've done with their lives, with the sin in this world. Revelation 20 verse 15, it tells us that when it's over, mankind stand before God, and those whose names are not written in the book of life will be cast in the lake of fire. There is a day of judgment coming. God will deal with the sin of this world, just like he had to deal with the sin in the nation of Israel. Indeed, he did deal with the sin in the nation of Israel. And it's because mankind, like Israel, has not retained God in knowledge. Secondly, notice here we see the priest before God. The priests. The priests are called to answer. Look at verse 4 and onwards. It says, "Yet let no man strive nor reprove another. For thy people are as they that strive with the priests. Therefore shalt thou fall in the day, and that also shall fall with thee in the night, and I will destroy thy mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget children. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore will I change their glory into shame. They eat up the sin of my people, and they set their heart on their iniquity, and they shall like people like priests. And I will punish them for their ways, and reward them for their doings. And reward them their doings, sorry. For they shall eat and not have enough. They shall commit whoredom and shall not increase, because they've left off and take heed, Lord. Whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart." You know, the nation as a whole has been called to stand before God, and they've been charged with breaking his commandments, forsaking him, not retaining God in their knowledge. But now the Lord turns his attention to the spiritual leaders of the nation of Israel, the spiritual leaders, the priests. You see, as far as God was concerned, the priests were responsible for the state of the nation. The priests were responsible for the spiritual condition that the nation of Israel found themselves in at this time. The priests were the ones who were supposed to lead the people to God. The priests were the ones who were supposed to give the people knowledge of God, tell the people who God is and what he is like, so that the people might then walk in truth. But you know, unfortunately, the priests had failed miserably in their responsibility. Now, verse 6 sums it up well for us. Excuse me. It says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. I will also reject thee. And thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget thy children." You see, the people were corrupt. The people were corrupt. They had not retained God in their knowledge. But the truth is that this was because the priests had not retained God in their knowledge. It was because the priests had not taught the people. The people were simply following the example of the spiritual leaders. The spiritual leaders were doing these things, so the people went, okay, well, we better do those things too. They were following the example of the priests. The sad truth is that these ones who were occupying the priestly office were not even appointed by God in the first place, and that was the problem. You see, when Jeroboam became the first northern Israel, he set up his own religious system, and he did this to stop the Israelites going south to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. And so for his new religious system, Jeroboam ordained priests of his own choosing. If you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 11. 2 Chronicles 11 verse 13 says, "And the priests and the Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him out of all their coasts. For the Levites their suburbs and their possession, and came to Judah and Jerusalem. For Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office under the Lord. And he ordained him priests for the high places, and for the devils, and for the calves which he had made." Jeroboam ordained his own priesthood. The true priesthood had fled south. They went to Jerusalem to worship God. And so Jeroboam sets up his own priesthood. These were not even ordained by God. The priests didn't know God. That's the point. These priests were counterfeit priests. They didn't know God themselves. They had no knowledge of God. They didn't know God's law. And so the fact of the matter is, how could they ever hope to lead God's people? How could they ever hope to lead God's people into anything but sin? You see, worldly, ignorant leaders always produce worldly, ignorant people. And that's what happened in the nation of Israel. The priests were worldly, they were ignorant, and they led people in sin. Now, verse 8 on to describe graphically for us how this encouraged the people in their sin. It says, they eat up the sin of my people, and they set their heart on their iniquity. See, the priests were not discouraging the sin, they were actually encouraging the people in sin. It says that they ate up the sin of the people, they set their heart on their iniquity. The idea is that the priests were prospering from the sins of the people, and so they wanted it to continue. The priests' bellies were being made fat, their coffers were full by the people's sin, and so the priests encouraged the people to sin more. They encouraged them in their sinful ways. They delighted in the people's sin. See, as the people sinned, they would bring an offering to the temple, to the places. And so the priests would receive the meat offerings. The priests would receive the fines, and they would fill their coffers. They became richer. That's what verse 7 is about. It says, and increased, so they sinned against me. It talks about the priesthood increasing in number. More and more people signed up. Hey, this is a good lurk. We get the priesthood. We get to partake in all the wickedness that's later listed in the passage. You know, the harlots at the temple, everything else. We get to partake in all that, and we get rich. It's a great lurk. And so the priesthood increased in number. More and more people signed up to be priests. And instead of discouraging sin, they actually had a vested interest in the people's continued sin. And they encouraged the people to sin further. Now, verse 9 says, and they shall be like people, like priests, and I will punish them for their ways and reward them their doings. Now, here we see that the priests and the people encourage one another in their sin. It says, and there shall be like people, like priests. The point is that as the people sin, the priests continue to sin. And the priests sin, the people sin more. They encouraged each other in their sin. They went deeper and deeper into debauchery and sin and wickedness. And in the eyes of God, they were all guilty. Like people, like priests, they were all guilty of this sin. And God says that they will reap the reward of their ways. That's what it says at the end of verse 9, and reward them their doings. Verse 10 describes their sin would end in no satisfaction. It says, for they shall eat and not have enough. They shall court them and shall not increase, because they have left off and take heed to the Lord. You see, their sin was going to eventually lead to no satisfaction. It was not going to bring increase. It was not going to bring increase to them anymore. Their sin was going to come to an end. That's the point. The time of judgment was coming. And then as you read verse 11 through to 14, we see the extent of the debauchery that had led the people in. In verse 11 it says, whoredom and wine, new wine, take away the heart. My people ask counsel at their stocks, and their staff declareth unto them. In other words, they worship idols. It's talking about idols there. For the spirit of whoredoms hath called them to err, and they have gone whoring from our God. They sacrifice upon the tops of the mountains, and burn incense upon the hills, under oaks and poplars and elms, because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor spouses when they commit adultery. For themselves are separate whores, and they sacrifice with harlots. Therefore the people that doth not understand shall fall. Now here we see just how degraded and sinful this nation has become. You know, the priests had led the people to absolute debauchery. These priestly ceremonies involved prostitution. They involved drunkenness, involved idolatry of every kind. That's how wicked and sinful the nation had become. And they were led there by the priests. The people had completely forgotten God. Excuse me. The very abominations The very sins that condemned the Canaanite people before them, the very things that they now were involved in themselves. And the priests were to blame for much of this because they were the spiritual leaders and they led the people in. As we read the charges against the spiritual leaders here, we are reminded of our responsibility, are we not? Our responsibility as the spiritual leaders, as a church, to be an example under this sinful world. Yes, this world is a place that has not retained God in their knowledge. This world has turned their back on the Lord. It's a wicked, sinful place. But we should still, as the church, be that shining light. We should still be the example of God's truth. The church is to show this world who God is, so that the world might see the truth and might turn to Him in faith. Matthew chapter 5, if you would. Matthew 5 and verse 13. Matthew 5 verse 13 says, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt hath lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted? It is therefore good for nothing, but to be cast out, to be trodden under the foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." You see, we are to be both salt and light unto this world. This is responsibility. We are to let our light shine before men so that they might know God and turn to truth in faith. And if we fail in our responsibility, as the priests in the northern kingdom failed, then the world will degenerate even further into sin than what they already have, without the shining light of the church. But the sad truth is that in the church in general, light has gone out. What the world calls the church, they throw in their Catholics, they throw in their everybody. What the world calls the church is corrupt, is it not? It's a corrupt church. There's spiritual leaders who care nothing for the truth of God. They care only for lining their pockets. Lining their pockets, making money. They want the people to continue to sin so they make more money. The Roman Catholic Church keeps changing the rules so they can have people, pay this and pay that, this and do that. It's ridiculous. And the world laughs and the world says, how does God change his mind all the time? The thing about divorce, the Catholic Church wants to legalize. And the world laughs. They say, God said it's not okay, so now you want to change it. You're saying God's changed his mind. The world laughs at the church. The church in general. Like the priests in the northern kingdom, the church in general eats up for the people and encourages the people in sin. Indeed, there are so many counterfeit churches today, so many counterfeit religions, cults, who are, rather than leading people to God, they are leading people away from God. The influence of godly leaders day and age is few and far between. It's not a coincidence that our world is sinking further and further into sin. It's not a coincidence that our world is becoming more and more morally corrupt, morally and spiritually corrupt. It's because the church is not the salt and light it should be in general. Because the spiritual leaders are just like these priests in the northern kingdom. They were corrupt, leading the people in sin rather than out of sin and towards God. And so notice with me, lastly, now we have the warning. The warning to the southern kingdom. In verse 15 and onwards it says, "Though thou, Israel, play the harp, yet let not Judah offend, and come not ye unto Gilgal. Neither go ye up to Bethaven, nor swear the Lord liveth. Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place. Ephraim is idols, him alone. Their drink is sour, they committed it whoredom continually. Her rulers with shame do love give ye. The wind hath bound her up in her wings, and they shall be ashamed of their sacrifices." The northern kingdom as a whole and the priests have been brought up on charges before God. They have been condemned because they have not retained God in their knowledge. But now God turns his attention to the southern kingdom of Judah. And essentially what happens is God warns them not to get involved with the sins of Israel. God says, stay away. Don't partake in their sin. In verse 15 it says, though thou, Israel, play the harlot, yet not Judah offends. And come not ye unto Gilgal, neither go up to Bethaven, nor swear the Lord liveth. They're warned not to offend as Israel did, not to join in with Israel in their sin and with them in their debauchery. They're told not to come up to the shrines at Gilgal and Bethaven. These were the places of worship in the northern kingdom, the places of idolatry. And God wants Jews to stay in the south, to stay down there away from Israel. Judah had the true place of worship, Jerusalem, the Temple Mounts. They had the true place of worship. They had the true priesthood. And Judah is warned to stay away apart with wicked Israel, who is condemned. Verse 16, Israel is described as a backsliding heifer. It says, for Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord feed them as a lamb in a large place. The word backsliding there has the idea of stubborn. Essentially, the northern kingdom, the Lord says, is a stubborn heifer. They will not submit to the Lord. Instead of being a submissive lamb to his will, they refuse to obey. And God warns Judah here to not make the same mistake. Verse 17 sums it up well. It says, Ephraim is joined to idols. In other words, the northern kingdom is joined to idols. Let him alone. Let him alone. In other words, Judah, stay away. Stay away. Have no part of Israel in their sin. And you know, there is a warning here today for us as well. You see, like Judah, we must stay away. We must stay away. We must not have part in the sin of the world, in the sin of the church in general. We must stand apart, stand separate. Like Paul tells the Corinthians in the New Testament, we must come out from among them and be separate, saith the Lord. That's God's will for us, to come out and be separate, to stand different. Even though everybody else might be falling, everybody else might be moving, we are to stand firm on the truth, stand firm in the knowledge of God, and not move from the knowledge of God, not move from the knowledge of the truth. God desires that we stand firm as salt and light in this world, that we represent him unto this lost and dying world. As it says in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20, we are to be ambassadors for Christ. You know, that's why we're here. We're just through. This is not our home. Our home is in heaven. We're ambassadors representing him on this earth. And therefore, we must not get caught up in the sin of this world. We must be holy as holy. The temptation comes when you and I look at the world and we look at the church in general, and we see the seeming success and the prosperity of those who are not living for God. The temptation then can come in our hearts to say, well, they're prospering, so they must be doing the right thing. The temptation can come to move, to change, so that we might prosper and have success as well. But you know, the Lord says that they will reap the reward of their sin. Turn to Psalm 37 as we close. Psalm 37. Psalm 37, verse 1. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt feed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in him. He shall bring it to pass. And he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who proweth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass. Cease from anger, and forsake. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil, for evildoers shall be cut off. But those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. For yet a little while shall not be, Yea, thou shalt diligently consider his place, and it shall not be. You know, the Lord is in control. It may seem like the world is prospering. It may seem like those cheaters who have forsaken the truth are prospering. But the Lord is in control and judgment is coming. And you and I must, like Judah, stay away. Unfortunately, didn't stay away, did they? Judah ended up in the same place as Israel. They didn't heed the warning of God. And you and I must heed the warning of God. And oftentimes we become proud and think we won't, not us. But so many churches have fallen. You and I must be careful that we continue to be salt and light unto this wicked world. You know, we have a responsibility to be salt and light unto this lost and dying world. And as the song says, we must let our shine till Jesus comes. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. And Lord, the judgments, Lord, here that are brought against the nation of Israel. Israel as a whole, and indeed the priesthood, Lord, leading the people in their sin. And Lord, ultimately it was because they did not retain you in their knowledge. And Lord, there is a warning for us, Lord, that as the spiritual leaders, your representatives on earth, Lord, we are to indeed be salt and light. Lord, we are not to follow in the ways of the world, the ways of others who have fallen. Stand firm upon the truth, upon our knowledge of you and what you are like. Lord, may you help us to remember these truths as we go from this place. And Lord, indeed, may we in this valley be salt and light for you. These things in Jesus' name.